And I will now introduce our first featured reader, Marjorie Lotfi. Let me get my notes. So Marjorie Lotfi is the author of The Wrong Person to Ask, Blood X Books 2023, a winner of the inaugural James Barrie Prize and a Poetry Book Society Special Commendation. And The World May Be the Same with the writer Hannah Lavery by Stuart Ruard Press, also in 2023, about the experiences of people of color living in Scotland. Her poetry has won awards and been published widely, most recently on London's Poems on the Underground. She's currently working on a memoir about her childhood in revolutionary Iran and Ohio. Marjorie also founded the Belonging Project, considering the experiences of refugees with over 1,500 participants across Scotland, and is co-founder and director of Open Book. Now, Marjorie, we have a ritual over here at Poetry Lit where I always do a little reflection beforehand of the work of a poet. And what I found so interesting in your poems is that from the first one I read, they gave me this full-bodied idea of place, of family, of roots, and of what it means being uprooted. And that it is not in the big things, the things we can all imagine if we try, but in the small things, the things you may well never have noticed before, the things that somehow only show their value when you have to leave them behind, like the sound of slippers on tiles, or a language, or a bedtime ritual. And throughout these poems, there lives the question of what it means to move and how identity shapes and forms, and what you can take, but also in what you have to leave behind, and how perhaps that which you cannot take becomes like the heavier part of who you are, just because you somehow still carry it. And that sort of also gives rise to the question I want to ask you, and that is, how has poetry shaped the world for you?
That's a big question. Yeah, I'm just going to reflect on what you said there. It's funny, when in the Belonging Project, I used to take this suitcase into schools and ask children, about the size of the suitcase we had when we left Iran, or when my mother and my brother and I left, and ask children what they would put in it if they had sort of 10 minutes to choose. And then the next week I would bring it back and put it on the table and say, now, what can't you get in it? And that was a much bigger question, I think. So thank you for that. How poetry has shaped me, I think it's allowed me to look at the detail, I think, in a way that we often so quickly gloss over, and ask those bigger questions of, as you say, what I've lost in the moving, in the exile of family, and particularly people and places, not necessarily physical objects, but a recipe from a family member that might have been passed down, or the faces of cousins I've never met, or all those sort of very large and also very small language, rituals that we've lost by leaving, and particularly by having to assimilate in a way that maybe people don't do as much now, although they probably do. So I think poetry's allowed me to explore that and unpack it. And I was saying earlier today in an event, I should say I'm at Newcastle at the Newcastle Poetry Festival, how we unpack those windows in the poetry that allows us that sort of grace to kind of go back and remind ourselves what we might have left behind and what we might have lost, but also just the ordinariness of things that we've lost, and how those, as you say, are kind of weightier than perhaps all the belongings that we left behind, or we lost everything, all the finances, our pet dog, all those sorts of really obvious things, but also all the ability to lift a teacup by its edge in the way that I should be able to do, and much smaller things. So poetry, I think, looks at the detail as a way in, and for me, that's shaped my reading of poetry, but also my writing of poetry.
Wow, wonderful, thanks. Yeah, and I was really struck how familiar it felt, even though I am, not from your background, but in the details, your poetry really managed to draw you in. So I invite you to draw us in.
Okay, thank you very much. So the first poem I'm going to read for you is actually the poem on the Underground just now, and I have no idea how that happened, but it did, and I'm delighted. And it's about my father leaving Iran to go to the US in the late 50s for an education, partly because his family really needed him to. They were losing the farm and he knew he was going to need to support them. But he didn't tell his mother he was leaving until the night before he left because he was the oldest of six, and they also needed him there. And this is his experience of him packing. I'm going to put my glasses on because I'm that age. Packing for America. He can't take his mother in the suitcase, the smell of choresht in the air, her spice box too tall to fit. Nor will it close when he folds her sajadah into its corners. He can't bring the way she rose and blew out the candles at supper's end, rolled the oilcloth up, marked the laying out of beds, the beginning of night. He knows the slap of her sandals across the tiles will fade. He tosses photographs into the case, though not one shows her eyes. Instead, she covers her mouth with her hand as taught and looks away. He considers strapping the samovar to his back like a child's bag, a lifetime measured in tea from its belly. Finally, he takes her tulip glass, winds a chador around its body, leaves the gold rim peeking out like a mouth that might tell him where to go, what is coming next. So he took a bunch of things in the case, and of course we still have some of them, and they are prized. But then, he met my mother and married, and we all went back to Iran, and I went as a relatively young baby. And then we left again during the revolution, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the next poem was inspired by a sculpture, which I'm hoping you'll be able to see in a minute, by Francis Bruno Catalano, of this man holding a suitcase. And for me, when I look at it, my brain starts to try and figure out how it's upright, how it's holding itself upright, despite so much of it being gone. And of course, I saw my own father both times he landed having had to leave his homeland. One a bit more traumatic, I would say, than the first one. Refuge. Take out his heart, lungs, one arm, the whole belly, and the belt strap that holds it all in place. Let the lighthouse beacon throw its false light through him, promise safe passage. Take out his thighs, but leave his knees to buckle at kindness and the lack of it. Don't loosen his grip on the suitcase. It holds all he owns. Instead, nail his feet to the planks of the pier and let him try to take another step. Thanks, Mila. So I think one of the things that I talk about in the book, this book that's just come out, is about the experience of being in Iran during the revolution and leaving it. But one of the other things I'm really interested in is what happens after that. What happens when we land in a place? And how long does it take to feel settled? What do we do with all those experiences? How do they wind their ways into our lives? And the next poem is on the cover I'm looking to see, my book is somewhere else, but is called Khanum, and it's in the voice of my father's great aunt, who was separated from her daughter at the closing of the Azerbaijani-Iranian border in 1917 during the Bolshevik uprising. And even though the daughter was an adult at the time, and there was only 150 miles between them, she never saw her daughter again. And so her face graces the cover of the book. But I thought I would give her her voice back. My dad's memory of her is her walking the garden in grief, having really lost her mind. So I thought she deserved her voice. Khanum, which was her name, Khanum. I am not interested in Bolsheviks. Instead, it's the way light fell across my daughter's sleeping face, how she ate pomegranate, mouth brimming with tiny jewels, the way her nostrils would flare at the sight of mulberries, but when offered, tarofing, she'd eat. Like swallows we migrate, but there's no spring and no autumn in this place. Along with the samovar and the janamaz, I was walked from Baku across the border, 150 miles, a distance I measured in the steps it would take to return. Now, in Tabriz, my grandson skips into the courtyard where I spend daylight wearing a path around the lilting fountain, speaking to the birds. He sits next to me under the mulberry tree and listens before asking if he can send a message back home too. Thank you. So I was talking a little bit about this on the panel earlier today about how the political becomes really personal when you have family still in a place. And so when people ask you what you think about, in my case, Iran or Ukraine or Gaza or many of these places, it's really hard to answer, I think, when there are people in the way, people that you love and care about. So this next poem I wrote many years ago when the Iran nuclear deal was signed with America. There is a pairing poem, which I won't read, which is when Trump took it down, as it were. But this poem, people at the time, people kept saying, what do you think? What do you think about the nuclear stuff? What do you think? What do you think? And I wrote this poem as a response to it. There's a couple of quick notes on it. The first, it has a reference to Chahar Shanbe Suri, which is a bit like bonfire night here. It's the last Wednesday before the turn of the year. Great fun with fireworks and bonfires in the streets for children. And the second is that it has a memory in it of my last sort of happy memory. My mum taking me swimming in the dark at the Caspian Sea, telling me there was something she wanted to show me, but she wouldn't tell me what it was. It's called On Seeing Iran in the News, I Want to Say. On seeing Iran in the news, I want to say my grandmother was called Nasreen, that she died 2 years ago in Tabriz, and I couldn't go to say goodbye, that she knew nothing of power, nuclear or otherwise. I want to say that the bonfires for Chahar Shanbe Suri, as children we were taught to jump over and not be caught by the flames, were built by our neighbors' hands. I want to say my cousin Elnaz, the one born after I left, has a son and 2 degrees in chemistry and had trouble getting a job. I want to say that the night we swam towards the moon hanging over the horizon of the Caspian Sea, we found ourselves kneeling on a sandbar we couldn't see, like a last gift. I want to say, I'm the wrong person to ask. Thanks. And then one last poem, ostensibly about Scotland, about a crabapple tree that lives on an uninhabited Hebridean island in the middle of nowhere up north in Scotland. Scientists were baffled about how it got there. It's out with the range that it should live in. It's not eaten by humans or animals, but it's been there in its purest form, they think, since the Ice Age. So they were excited about the DNA of this tree. I was, of course, thought about the people who stay in conflict, whether that's the clearances in Scotland or my family who stayed behind in Iran and didn't come out, or worse now, the people in Gaza who are stuck. And haven't been able to leave. So I'll read this last poem and thank you in honor of the Gazans. The Hebridean Crabapple. This I understand, the instinct to cling at any cost to the place you are rooted, to see another season through, though the others seed elsewhere. Even in this sedentary act, you push the limit. Winter becomes summer, becomes winter, and you are steadfast on your crag, your outcrop. No one knows the shape of your limbs against a darkening sky. You question the need to grow against the wind. Despite what they say, there's no mystery in simply holding on. And what is home, if not the choice over and over again to stay? Thanks, everyone.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.